I'm Scott Kennedy. I'm Deputy Director of the Freeman Chair in China Studies at CSIS and also Director of our project on Chinese business and political economy. And it's an honor to be moderator for this panel on political and economic developments in mainland China. This is a topic over which you could have a full day or a full week conference, and we're going to do it in 75 minutes for you. And I think, of course, there's a whole range of questions one could ask. Some things that are on my mind that I hope the panelists touch upon, although they have every right to ignore anything that I'd suggest or ask. The first has to do with elite politics and the centralization under Xi Jinping and where things are going toward the 19th Party Congress. Hopefully they've already received detailed briefings from the leadership, and we'll just report on that for us today. The second has to do with the Chinese bureaucracy, both at the central level and between the central government and localities. And that those relationships have evolved, become, are, I think in many ways, potentially different from how they've been prior to Xi Jinping's arrival. And that certainly could affect how China engages with Taiwanese. And lastly, the economy, which I think everyone's aware faces a great deal of challenges and has a lot of volatility. China is currently implementing what they call supply-side reforms, which in some areas means reducing overcapacity, and in other areas increasing supply of high-tech and high-value-added goods. In addition, they've got a considerable amount of debt as well, no small challenges. All of these things ought to affect how mainland China engages Taiwan and vice versa. Luckily, we have four terrific panelists. I'm not going to go into detail about their careers. You've got their biographies. And we're going to go along this order, which conveniently represents the distance from which they traveled to get here. So we're going to go from farthest to closest. We'll start with Shusa Jian, who is the president of the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy. Then Zhou Zhijie will go next, and he's professor at National Chengchi University. And then from the south side of Chicago, my son goes to school on the north side, a little bit further away. Yang Da Li, professor at University of Chicago, and then my partner in crime at CSIS, the holder of the Freeman Chair at CSIS, Chris Johnson. So each speaker will talk for about 10 minutes. You're happy to come up, welcome to come up here or sit where you are. We've got someone in the front who will remind you. Regardless of whether you're standing here or at your mic, just speak closely for recording purposes, and so all of our friends in the back and around the world can hear your thoughts. So we'll start first with Shusa Jian.
Thank you, Scott, for your introduction, and I would like to thank Brookings Institution, CSIS, and IR for inviting me to this very important event. Today, I would like to talk about the title of my talk is Xi Jinping's Big Chess Match. I have this metaphor to describe the what he's facing. From last panel, we heard about remarks like, when is Xi Jinping going to lose his patience? I hope it's not his temper. And also timetable for Tsai Ing-wen. Actually, there is a very hard timetable for Xi Jinping himself. That is the 19th Party Congress. That lays very hard constraint on his calculation. So here is the metaphor of chess match. I think Xi Jinping is facing 4 chess boards at the same time. The first, the most important one, can I use this? There's a light here. The middle?
Oh, yeah, no, that top.
The top, okay. Anyway, let me use this. Yeah, this elite politics is actually the central of the picture, the center of the scenario, that he's facing power struggles within his own ruling bloc. And he's also at the same time facing an economy that is not only slowing down, but also faces a lot of pitfalls. And he is also facing a state-society relationship which he has put heavy hands on, pressed down a lot of NGOs and activists and lawyers. But lastly, but not the least, is the diplomatic and security environment that China is facing. The thing is, with elite politics, it has ramification on all of these domains. But at the same time, the way he manages these domains, or their own independent logic, for example, the structural adjustment of economy, the economy can also have implications for foreign environment. For example, when this global economy is slowing down, then and China has this one road, one belt strategy, which will have very far-fetching strategic geopolitical implications. So actually, China needs a more friendly international environment, which sometimes is doing the contrary. And if the domestic stability is not good, then there is an incentive for an authoritarian regime to appeal to some kind of external conflict to divert the domestic pressure. So these things are linked together. But at the same time, as I said, the way that things evolve in this domain independently can also have a reverse impact on elite politics. For example, the extent to which the economy has been well managed, the oppression or suppression that the regime has put on the society, and the repercussion from international environment can all lead back to the pressure within the elite politics. As we all see, in this year, there has been some public letter registering a complaint to Xi Jinping himself on the website of Xinjiang. A letter from some comrades. Within the letter exactly was about these points, and all these mistakes that they accuse Xi Jinping has made on these things. So this is, I think, the chess boards that Xi Jinping is facing. I'm going to skip some of these more theoretical things, but this is my academic view, that the China itself is a post-totalitarian authoritarianism. So there are certain constraints constraining its transition. To put in short, it's really difficult for a post-totalitarian regime to transform into a democracy very easily. Some people say both previous KMT, how many minutes? 5, okay. Some people say KMT and the CCP, they are all party states, so they should go through a same trajectory, but I have reservation on that. Because KMT was actually a half authoritarianism. It has election already, when it moves to Taiwan. But in China, there is no substantial meaning for election. And this is a commitment problem. There are two kinds of commitment problem. One kind of commitment problem is between the dictator and his ruling colleagues, that there should be some kind of balanced power, balance among the factions, or the dictator should adhere to the explicit or implicit rules set among themselves, so that they don't have to worry about challenging each other. But these things have been broken by Xi Jinping's practices. Sometimes Xi Jinping doesn't have other choices, because sometimes the other factions are imposing personal threat to himself. So he has to fight back very harshly, and So his concentration of power and indiscriminate oppression of civil society actually exacerbates the problem of commitment problems. So we also talk about Xi Jinping's enemies from last panel. Who are his enemies? Actually, Xi Jinping has this perception that there is a threat to overthrow the regime by a clandestine coalition between overseas opponent forces, so to speak, 境外敌对势力, and domestic instigating elements. But actually, there's no one in the civil society that can really impose credible threat to the regime. They are all very separated, and there is no opposing political party. So the real enemy actually comes from within, particularly the threat to his personal power within the ruling elite circle. I identify 3 groups of enemies within the ruling elite circle. The first one is the Jiang Zemin remnant faction. I think most of the anti-corruption campaign is waged against this group of enemy because they have posed personal threat to him, close to a coup. And the second group is the Communist Youth League. We have seen news reporting that the Communist Youth League school has been seized to recruit new students. I think that's very detrimental decision. And the third, actually the most important group of enemy is the princelings families. Because these princelings families, they are the ones originally supported Xi Jinping to come to the power. But they are also the ones that is the most important obstacles for his reform, particularly on the state-owned enterprises. So, and they are also the one that could become potential alternative rulers. So Xi Jinping is facing this situation that it is really difficult to overcome the corruption problem because the corruption problem comes from within, particularly those princeling families. So Xi Jinping, he needs an alternative legitimate source beyond the party. That's what he needs. So I think it is unlikely to have a direct transition to democracy, but more likely to transition to a new dictatorship, new form of dictatorship with a more democratic sugarcoating as an appearance. So the implication for cross-strait relations is that why is Xi Jinping losing his patience? Because he's too much challenge within. That is the reason. Not because Tsai Ing-wen complete half of the answer. She is still completing the answer. Why would anyone losing patience? I don't lose my patience with my students if they answer the exams. You should keep the patience, encourage them, right? I never lose my patience. Otherwise, I would be a bad teacher. I mean, and then why is always China losing its patience? Why is not Taiwan? Because it's more powerful. Okay, so that's the only logic. Not that we're doing wrong. So that's one thing. And I would say 92 consensus is actually not serving Xi Jinping's own purpose. Because once you hold onto this yardstick, you're pushing yourself to the corner of the room, not Tsai Ing-wen. Because once you step away from that, as Richard said, you will be challenged by your internal enemies in the party Congress. So we would encourage them. We will not lose our patience. We would encourage Xi Jinping to think otherwise for the benefits of both sides. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sejian. Okay, we're going to turn now to Professor Zhou.
Thank you, Chair. Feel glad to be invited at this conference, and I want to share my observation about the recent China's socio-economic development. But because of the limit of time, so I think I would like to focus on the societal dimension in China. Okay, I think that China's recent society is basically stable, but certainly not peaceful. It is to say that although the social arrest is still under the party state's control, but it revealed the extent of the difficulty of comprehensive deepening reform. Firstly, in terms of the social protest, according to my own research and the field study, the most protesting subject are people from social vulnerable groups, such as farmers, workers, and the migrant workers. And there are also, during the past 2 years, and there are also about 20% of protests initiated by people from the middle class. That's a new situation, such as teacher, business person, self-employment individual, and the business owner. So it shows that the middle class traditionally the middle class is exempt from the conflicts, but this new situation showed that the middle class is not exempt from the conflict caused by the transforming social structure and has to stand out for their own rights and benefit. As for the issue of protest, 9/10 concerned materialism, okay, which means the pursuit of food, clothing, and the rights of survival. About 1/10 concerns post-materialism. It shows that the most protests are still driven by the pursuit of material benefit. So the government use of the suppression as means to response is higher than the past. On the contrary, the percentage of the use of the negotiation has decreased rapidly, shows that the face of the government faced with the pressure of the Weiwen, especially local government has increased the use of suppression as a means of response. So the local government's previous strategy of paying money for peace, or we can say that using renminbi to resolve internal conflict, has started to change. As for the management of the social organizations in recent years, show that the three major trends for me. The first one is the relaxation of the dual management system. The second one is the purchase of public service by the government. And the third one is the establish the core gangos. Okay. And for the relaxation of the dual management system, some organizations in most provincial cities are only required to register at civil affairs authorities. However, the relaxation just applies to organizations helping the government with economic and social governance, such as business, technology, charity, and the community service sectors. Secondly, the purchase of public service by the government means that the government provide funds and the resources to attract civil groups to apply for the participation in social service. Thirdly, the establishment of so-called core organizations means to have an existing civil group or new gango serve as a core organizations to share management of relevant grassroots organizations, or maybe you can say out of systems organization, or lay those core organizations to allocate the resources so as to achieve the government goal of the managing people with people or managing organization with organizations. So the three tendencies show the government's intention to involve social organizations in public service. Okay. So, and for the overseas NGOs, all we know that the most recent change is the overseas NGO management law. And the Ministry of Public Security is entitled to monitor overseas NGOs and check their funding sources, and the development of their projects. previously, the Ministry of Civil Affairs was the central minister that worked the most closely with overseas NGOs. But according to the new law drawn up by the Minister of the Public Security, so it implies that it will further its control of overseas NGOs, and the possible negative consequence we're still observing. Okay. So generally, the government adapt both soft and hard approaches for the social control. The use of the social policy and the welfare to try to distribute the public discontent this is a kind of a soft approach. While the pressure on the Protestant, regulation of NGOs, cyber control, and the arrest of human rights lawyers and some dissidents are hard approaches. So we can see the facts of the social unrest are mostly constrained by the party's forceful control. However, many problems are not resolved. Perhaps to some degree, the ruling by law emphasized by Xi Jinping might be a way out. But in fact, there is a little difference between Xi's policy in social control and the laws in Hu Jintao and the Jiang Zemin's eras, for me. But the implementation of Xi Jinping's measures and the policies has been much more significantly enhanced. Okay. So my concrete remarks is that Xi now faces a critical moment, just presented by the Professor Xu. So therefore, especially the pressure of a slowing economic continue to grow. So therefore, the political situation in China is characterized by the management of economic issue with political means. As the economic outlook becomes severe, the control of public opinion, the internet, and its party elite and official becomes stricter. So we can witness Xi, on the one hand, his sense of urgency to many reforms, try to run all the reforms simultaneously. And on the other hand, a clear signs of a more authoritarian rule. Okay. That's all my point, and I beg you comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yang Dali.
I'll stand here so that
Okay.
people can see me. In fact, I see on the screen here a very interesting from Professor Xu's presentation on the chess match. In fact, I want to mention that President Xi, in fact, likes sports. In fact, there are investors who invest heavily now in soccer because that's one of the sports that he likes. So Chinese investors are buying football teams in Europe in particular. And in fact, there is speculation that some of those investments may even be listed back in China. But in fact, some of you may also know President Xi likes another game called Go. And in fact, when you read Henry Kissinger's book on China, he also starts with the fact that Chinese leaders actually, so this is important in thinking about Chinese thinking, because Go is a much more strategic game that's played more for the long haul. And of course, one of President Xi's former friends is, in fact, this a Go player by the name of Nie Weiping. So, but what I'm thinking, however, is President Xi likes all those sports besides chess, but he's playing them simultaneously. And that actually shows the kind of crowded agenda that he has. He has so many positions besides the presidency, besides the chairmanship of the Central Military Commission. He's also taking on leaderships of the economy, the foreign policy, reform, military reform, cybersecurity. It can go on and on. In fact, even if only a small proportion of the reforms that have been announced are fulfilled, he will be considered to be very successful. The challenge, however, is many people in China feel like that, in fact, he's not moving fast enough on many of those issues. In fact, some of the disenchantment comes from the fact that he's set such an ambitious agenda and only so much has been achieved. But I think they are wrong in that regard, because a couple of the reforms that he's already launched, in fact, are in particular related to the anti-corruption campaign. You may know, and you read actually every day, there are officials who commit suicide. In some localities, whether it's Tianjin or Liaoning, there are more officials inside the jail than outside at the senior levels. And at the same time, really, in many ways, it's changed the dynamics of the bureaucracy, which is one of the issues that Scott has mentioned. Many officials that used to be able or would have been very aggressive in pursuing certain kind of construction projects in the past would not want to do them because they cannot get the card anymore and it's a political risk. Risk avoidance is key for Chinese officials today throughout the bureaucracy. And it's about avoiding the risk of political trouble in many ways, and that's very important. The other aspect related to the anti-corruption campaign is, in fact, in the military. We know that the two former vice chairmen of the Central Military Commission, one died while awaiting, or basically awaiting his death, otherwise he would have been persecuted. The other has been essentially thrown into in jail. So in that sense, it's the senior military establishment. Actually, it's not a joke. The saying is the Communist Party lost many more generals in the anti-corruption campaign than the entire anti-Japanese campaign or war in the 1930s and 40s, which is true in many ways, actually. But part of the issue really relates to the fact that the Communist Party, the Red Army, didn't fight the Japanese as aggressively. So in this connection, in fact, President Xi has launched this far-reaching military reform, including a reconfiguration of the military command system. In fact, you really need the anti-corruption campaign in order to pursue the reforms. You need the authoritarian approach in order to be able to pursue reforms in various sectors, and especially in terms of the military. And of course, in the meantime, this is the way to consolidate, to really establish control. Because one of the big challenges for the Chinese leadership, in fact, is that when you become the president, people do not tender their resignation. You have to replace them over time, and you need to bring in your own people. And of course, finding one's own people is also another challenge in the process. As a result, I think actually you can see the kind of really what Arthur had mentioned to be an all-front war that President Xi is actually pursuing. And that's really the big challenge in this regard. Now, I do have to say that in this context, however, the leadership is very confident. Generally speaking, they still have that confidence. Of course, they were the most confident in around 2009 to 2012, when the China model was at its zenith in many ways. But if you read President Xi's speech to the G20 meeting in Hangzhou, he in fact included a line basically saying that China needs to propose solutions for issues of global governance. Now, that's actually not a line to be missed, because it again shows that the Chinese leadership are saying that China not only has found a way to continue to grow, but in fact, that they actually now are in the leadership position in terms of thinking about global issues, and they want to be playing host, for example, to the G20, but also doing other issues, on other issues as well. In fact, historically, Chinese leaders, you have to go back to the time of the anti-Japanese war, when, for example, President Keqiang at that time and President Roosevelt were constantly in communication. Today, of course, you have a Chinese leader who is actually communicating and meeting with the most foremost leaders of the world regularly. And he's around when President Obama has retired and so on. So therefore, he's acting as a global leader in a way that actually was not easy in the past in this regard. And in this case, I think I want to mention very briefly, actually, the grand strategy in this case. Because when you think about this ambition, the national ambition of being a global leader, you connect it with the One Belt, One Road initiative of China, helping its domestic economy, but really reaching out to the Middle East, to Europe, and of course to other parts of the world. That's a very ambitious agenda. It just helps. It just happens to help with the domestic economy. But that ambition, however, harks back to Chinese history, to the Silk Road in particular. It also solves certain national security issues. For example, going through Pakistan would help to deal with, ameliorate the security bottlenecks in terms of having all the major source of oil going through the Malacca Strait potentially. Now, in this connection, I do want to mention that the South China Sea disputes and the East China Sea, of course, we can pause on the details, on all the issues, but it really fits into this global strategy of establishing or certainly making China stronger in terms of global strategy. And of course, as you all know, you go back to Sun Tzu and others, the strategy fundamentally is also to establish such a position for China so that it could win without having to fight, right? That's the ideal in terms of this kind of strategy. Of course, it doesn't always happen that way, but fundamentally, however, this is very important. And of course, in terms of the South China Sea and the East China Sea, it's so important to China's global reach in terms of the oceans and in terms of the global strategy in there. In terms of also, of course, in this connection of being able for China to stand up, and you look at this morning's paper in terms of what the Philippine president just mentioned, it actually really plays to that. And of course, in that context, Taiwan fits into, the approach to Taiwan fits into this broader context. Now, I do want to mention in this, in my last minute or so, in fact, it's not that the Chinese leadership did not see what's happening in Taiwan coming. They did. They rushed to complete the deals with the Ma Ying-jeou administration in particular. The 23 agreements were their way to ratchet up relations across the strait so that actually they can really put a flaw in terms of this relationship. And in the context, however, they also anticipated that there would be some turbulence, but they don't really send it back to the Chen Shui-bian era in many ways. And of course, I think the talks earlier also indicated that relations continue in this with the agreements already. But at the same time, they can be patient, in fact. I do want to mention, with the half minute remaining, is that foreign policy and national policy today, however, are not just left to national leaders to decide. You look at North Korea, for example, the public sentiments in China is turning. Likewise, in the past, the Chinese leadership was able to use nationalism to affect relations with Japan. But today, so many Chinese from the mainland are traveling to Japan. They love it, it turned out. And those kind of sentiments are extremely important. And for the same reason, the leadership recognizes that nationalism is a dangerous weapon, in fact, to use, whether it's with regard to Japan or North Korea or Taiwan for that matter. So in this context, I think actually that also helps to affect and to sort of really affect the framework for cross-strait relations. Thank you for your attention.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Dali. All right, well, our last presenter, Chris Johnson.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you to my co-panelists. Difficult to wrap up after all those good comments. I'm going to try to focus my comments a little bit more on the specific issue of the leadership transition that will be taking place next year, because I think while we've heard a lot today about how Xi Jinping is fighting a multi-front war with foreign policy and the economy and other issues, I think it's fair to say that most of the indications that we're getting, especially within the last month or so, is that his focus is now tunneling in very, very tightly on the party Congress. There's several reasons for this. I think, first of all, President Xi has shown himself thus far to be very much a traditional Chinese leader. And in that, I think his view is people first and then policies. And so he understands and continues to understand and is reminded every day by the setup that he currently faces that getting the Politburo right and to his liking next year will be incredibly important. And I think has a lot to do with a lot of the perennial questions that we're facing as analysts, such as, is reform in China dead? You know, I'm just back from Beijing actually last night, and I'm quite struck by the sort of tone that you hear, the fewer and fewer people who are willing to sort of suggest that, well, you know, longstanding view has been, well, he's cracking down now, but then once he gets his way at the Party Congress, he'll, you know, remove the mask and show himself to be China's Gorbachev or whatever some people think. I can't see any indication of that, but more and more you get a sense of very much a gloomy picture, and it's because it's hard to see any elites in the Chinese system who are happy at this particular moment. Certainly, as some of my colleagues have highlighted, the high-level elites in the leadership don't like Xi Jinping very much. They're losing a lot of their power and influence because of his growing power and influence and his strength in the system. Business elites in China aren't happy for a number of reasons, especially SOEs, given the pressures they're facing and the likelihood of coming reforms. The only people who seem to be happy with Xi Jinping's leadership are the broad masses of the Chinese people, wherein he continues to still be quite popular, and I think that's something worth looking at. Secondly, I just want to touch on the fact that I think the challenge for us as analysts looking at Chinese domestic politics arguably now is the most difficult it's been in at least 20 or 30 years. I find it very difficult to try to get a sense of the directions. I think there's a couple reasons for this. One, as we've all seen and heard, Xi Jinping has made the system extraordinarily opaque. There are very few people now in the system, I think, who really know what's going on. And even if they know what's going on, they're not quite sure where Xi Jinping is. And this is very much part and parcel of his political style, which is to keep his cards very close to the vest, look very steady as he goes along, and then when no one's looking, swing around from behind and smack whomever his opponent of the day appears to be. And then the second thing is, I think we see a situation in which the dynamism across Chinese society and its role in the world and in the region is such that the cycles, if you will, of the pendulum swinging on policy within the system are much faster than before. You know, when you had in the past, when we had these groupings dueling it out amongst each other, you know, it might swing this way for 6 months and then this way for 6 months. I find it quite interesting that it seems to be swinging almost monthly, if not faster, especially in recent months. If you look, especially on economic policy, you know, from the May 9th authoritative person article that got so much attention with regard to emphasizing supply-side structural reform and worries about debt loads and so on, to what is very clearly in the last few weeks a swing back to an expansionary fiscal policy within the government spending. Clearly, there's a lot of tussle going on inside the system. So to look at it from the perspective of what is the best way, the best framework to understand how Xi Jinping is thinking about this, it's helpful, I think, to take a look at a few clues that we saw before the leadership went off for its summer vacation and policy discussions at Beidaihe, after that took place, and then look a little bit at Xi Jinping's strategy for the Party Congress. I would say in advance of the Beidaihe meetings, and you know, I know there are still some analysts who dispute whether the Beidaihe meetings take place anymore or not. All I can say is our team at CSIS looked at the issue very closely, and strangely enough, from July 30th to about August 12th, there were no appearances anywhere of any Politburo Standing Committee members, save one, and that was Liu Yunshan at Beidaihe. So our sense is most likely they definitely went up there for their annual policy consultations. Prior to those meetings, it's quite striking that Xi Jinping hosted a Politburo meeting, I believe it was July 28th or 27th, right near the end of July, where he signaled that the theme for the plenum this fall, which will come up next month, would be these new discipline regulations for the party. And I find this to be quite striking in terms of what it tells us about Xi Jinping's agenda and how he thinks. 6 plenums generally are about either culture or ideology or both in the Chinese system. So I find it quite striking that Xi Jinping's definition of culture and ideology is anti-corruption. That's very telling. Secondly, it was not by coincidence that right after that Politburo meeting, the organization department of the party and the party's Discipline Inspection Commission announced that they were sending out joint teams into the provinces to oversee succession in the provinces. So clearly it was a message of intimidation, I think, from Xi Jinping before they headed off for these discussions, that I'm watching you, the anti-corruption campaign continues afoot, and don't mess with me, I think was basically the message. So what has happened since they seem to have concluded those meetings? Well, one, Xi Jinping held a very significant meeting on August 17th on his Belt and Road Initiative. And we saw the entire leading group of the leaders who oversee the Belt and Road Initiative, but more importantly, several key provincial party secretaries, many of whom are Politburo members, talking about their experience with Belt and Road and so on. So as to, in my sense, remind everyone in the collective audience in China that, this is my signature initiative, I'm pushing this forward, and I'm, claiming the agenda here. Secondly, we continue to see the anti-corruption campaign moving on. We just had the fall of the Tianjin mayor and longtime acting party secretary. That happened while I was there. And his quick replacement with Li Hongzhong, the party secretary from Hubei. There's lots of speculation, obviously, about what that means, but most interestingly is the effort to try to define, well, a lot of analysts had thought Huang Xingguo, the Tianjin mayor, was close to Xi Jinping. So why did he get collapsed? I think it's a sense on Xi Jinping's part that he's trying to signal the system. Any of you who thought that the anti-corruption campaign is going to slow down anytime soon, this is another sort of argument you get very regularly. You're off base. Turning to sort of his strategy for the party congress, I think what we're seeing develop and picked up in some of the comments by my colleagues is what you might call Xi Jinping's agenda for the party congress versus what you might call the agenda of the system, however you want to define the system inside China. Xi Jinping's agenda, in my assessment, is best described as disruptive for the party congress. And what do I mean by that? If he gets his way, my sense is that he will do several things that we would not expect. The first is he will not signal the succession, my sense, if he gets his way. Obviously, in the last several rounds of this, at the mid-cycle party congress, we know who the next leader of China is going to be. In this case, I don't think that's going to happen if he gets his way, for several reasons, but I think actually the primary one is the sense that he feels he has to have as much power and authority as he possibly can for the second 5-year term, or maybe the second on the way to the third. No one knows. There's a lot of speculation about that. Secondly, I think he will ignore a lot of the patterns of promotion that they have been sort of using in the last several rounds of party congresses. The so-called age restrictions, it's important to remember that these are not rules inside the Chinese system. If it's not in the party constitution, it's not a rule. Jiang Zemin invented these for purely political purposes, and there's no reason that Xi Jinping, with the power he has, can't maneuver those some more. But more importantly, I think he's going to strike at the sort of stepwise, institutionalized looking way patterns of promotion. So take, for example, Li Yuanchao, the current vice president, a Politburo member. Certainly by the practices they've been following for the last 20 years, he should be going to the Politburo Standing Committee. Obviously, there's lots of speculation that he might go to the jailhouse instead. We'll see whether or not that comes to be true. But I think if Xi Jinping gets his way, he won't be there. And so who's opposing Xi Jinping's agenda? We've had some comments from one of my colleagues as to who these groups might be. I prefer to look at it as what we might call the system, by which I mean those who want to see those patterns that they've been following for the last several rounds of transition continue to be followed. Why? Because they understand that Xi Jinping is going to make a play for a maximalist win at the Party Congress. And if he is successful, the groups that have been sort of influential in the last 20 years are going to lose. And he will have a much stronger hand. So the question really boils down to, can Xi Jinping amass enough power and persuade enough people to be able to disrupt those patterns that the system's been following for some time? So let me stop there and welcome questions.
Terrific. I think a very nice coverage of what's going on in China politically, economically. Some variation in terms of how much pressure people feel Xi is under versus how confident he ought to feel. I think one thing would be, who's right and who's wrong. Are people underestimating Xi, or is Xi overconfident? It's got to be one or the two, and then just simply the differences in perceptions also ought to affect how people behave and where things are going. But what I want to do now is turn to the audience and have you all feel free to ask questions again. Wait for the microphone. Identify yourself and your institution, and keep your comment in the form of a question. We'll go to the far back.
Gregory Ho from Radio Free Asia. My question is about successor. I don't think I will see the Hong Kong successor issue, which is the more imminent and more experimental to test who inside the party have the control of a city that the most important among all. Now we call the CY Leung, who is under Tong Chi-hua, and Tong Chi-hua somehow traced back to Jiang Zemin. So we all said the CY Leung is somehow like from the Jiang Zemin faction. Until nowadays, we don't see him announcing any campaign for the re-election for the next March. So my question to the panel will be, if the Hong Kong succession issue would be a battleground or a test field for the current internal struggle of the CCP's elites, who will be the next successor in this special administrative region? Do you have any names in your mind? Thank you.
Who would like to take this one? And I proud of your diction. You said succession, not secession. That's important to keep in mind in thinking about Hong Kong these days. So who would like to take this question? Chris?
I would only say that it doesn't strike me that the issue of succession, the chief executive, is going to be something that's going to cause real trouble inside the Chinese leadership. My sense is the leadership appears to be quite unified on the approach to Hong Kong. I think the issue to probably emphasize is, will Beijing take the opportunity that they have to have a look at the recent election results in Hong Kong and determine whether they can be confident enough to pick one among several candidates that appear to be emerging that have some credibility with Hong Kongers and aren't just seen as sort of toting Beijing's line. But that'd be the only thing I have to say.
Sure. Tom?
I would like to add that, in fact, the challenges in Hong Kong, since we are at a conference on cross-strait relations, actually, the troubles in some ways in Hong Kong are really good in terms of when in comparison with the issues in Taiwan, because Hong Kong constantly looms on the mind of mainland leaders nowadays. So as a result, they have to spend a lot of time on thinking through the Hong Kong issue.
So Jim?
I don't have any clue about the names. But I heard from some of my Hong Kong friends about the Fishbowl Rebellion issue. They think that the way the local police handled this issue was very unusually harsh, which actually has the effect of destabilizing Hong Kong's order and does not serve the purpose of Beijing. So a lot of people have a lot of suspicion on who was behind this. And so that's one thing I heard about. Another thing I have to say, following Dali's point, since this is talking about cross-strait relations, I have to tell you, from Taiwan's perspective, it has very bad example. It's a very bad example of one country, two systems, given what's going on in Hong Kong to Taiwan. This formula is losing a lot of credibility given what's going on in Hong Kong. So I don't know if that's in the mind of Beijing's leadership, but this is very true. Yeah.
I think to some degree, Hong Kong's elections result maybe can serve as kind of indicator for the hardliner and the softliner in Zhongnanhai. Because right now the possible three candidates for the next year's 特首, the one is Liang Zhenying, the other two is Zheng Yucheng and Zheng Junhua. And all we know that Zheng Yucheng just 3 weeks ago became a Time magazine's figure in the front page. And the title said by the Time magazine actually is Hong Kong's Hope. So it's a very strange shift because we know that Zheng Junhua, for the long time, he served as the speaker of the Hong Kong's Legislative Council. And he's kind of a soft line of the Beijing's politician. And Liang Zheng represented the hawkish ways of the Beijing's politician. So if the Liang Zheng can can be elected for his second term, that means the Xi or the hardliner toward Hong Kong's situation take advantage. And especially after the Zhang Dejiang visited Hong Kong 1.5 months ago, Liang Zheng shifted his approach, the hawkish approach, to softener toward the so-called the pan-democratic front in Hong Kong, and even keep a more mild approach to those so-called radical Hong Kong independence, those young generation, we call this a post-Emperor Revolution, those politicians, and those young person. Most of them, they were elected as the lawmaker in this just past election. So I think the next indicator for the Hong Kong's election and from the Beijing perspective is those radical pro-independent new lawmaker can be or not invited by Beijing to visit Beijing, because that's a custom. Is that all new lawmaker, especially the pan-Beijing or the soft pan-democratic lawmaker can be invited to Beijing. So this time we can observe those new generation, those post-umbrella revolutions, the leader of those movements, especially for those who get elected as a lawmaker, can be whether or not they can be invited to visit Beijing. Okay, that's my comment.
All good comments. Okay, right here in the fifth row.
Hi, Nadia Chow with the Liberty Times. I have a question for Mr. Christopher Johnson. I think many people in Taiwan want to know that for the Taiwan policy, is Xi Jinping is really the dominant figure, can make all the major decisions, because we saw a lot of speculation that sometimes he has, people trying to pretend to help him, but actually hurting his Taiwan policy. And so from your perspective, is he really, totally control of the Taiwan policy? And early on, Richard mentioned there seems to be a change of expectation from Beijing to Tsai Ing-wen's response, especially on the 92 consensus. From her inauguration, people thought that Taiwan may already pass the major challenge, but later on we saw a different demand. Do you recognize this, or do you have a different opinion? Thank you.
Thank you, and certainly would welcome my co-panelists' views on this as well. My own is that he is firmly in control of Taiwan policy, like he's firmly in control of most other elements, or all other elements of policy, from what I can tell. So I don't think there's any great struggle over Taiwan policy. His views are probably do tend toward the more firm, but as we've heard already this morning, he's been willing to show some level of flexibility in his approach. I think that one of the concerns we talked earlier on an earlier panel about unlikely but unexpected possibilities that could come up. One of those, I think, is that the sense that I get when I look at this problem is in the previous administration, when they were pursuing the policies of pro-engagement, there's always a constituency on the Chinese side, on the mainland side, that argues we have given Taiwan quite a bit, whether it be ECFA or early harvest and so on. And yet, on the core issue of sovereignty, what have we gotten in return? Nothing, right? And I think the people who were pushing the policies, Hu Jintao and his colleagues of the sort of engagement, were saying, yes, but you'll admit that the economic benefits have been pretty nice, haven't they? And those others, I think, then would say, well, okay, I guess you're right, and struggle along with that. With the seeming shift in some of the economic strategy under the Tsai administration, looking more toward the South policy and so on, I'm concerned that the voices that argue that we're not getting anything will get louder. In other words, if that economic leg is perceived in the mainland as being somehow kind of kicked out from underneath the relationship, the voices could get much stronger, and I'm not sure how much persuasion Xi Jinping would require to listen to them.
Anyone else? Let me do a two-finger on this, not on Taiwan policy, but on a person who, to me, looks like the bureau chief of administrative reform in Beijing, a gentleman named Keqiang. Also the premier, but doesn't seem to be doing much of the premier's typical duties. But there's been a lot of reporting, and maybe this is just a echo chamber, about the tension between Xi Jinping and Keqiang, and what this means for the back and forth in policy, perhaps, that Chris cited, or the level of confidence that Xi Jinping may or may not have. I know Dali said that she feels relatively confident playing all these different games at the same time. But does that mean, then one would wonder, why does he need to be amass so much power and leave the premier with very little? Li Keqiang's coming to the United States next week, but it's his first trip outside Asia this year. He's been allowed to go as far as Mongolia and Laos before this trip. So I was curious what you all see in that relationship between these two pivotal figures.
First of all, in fact, I think to this day, there hasn't been a formal announcement of Li Keqiang's visit to the U.S. from the Chinese side. The Canadian side has already indicated, is announcing that he's visiting Canada and so on. So it's really a very interesting kind of phenomenon. I think you're absolutely right in this context that there was actually internally some criticism of the relationship, in the sense that Li Keqiang was so significantly overshadowed that he simply became just so focused on just the one issue called innovation. So as a result, there was some discontent related to that. Now, I don't want to go into the complexities, but in fact, part of the issue is also because some of the policies of innovation, especially in the financial sphere, produced repercussions that didn't help Li Keqiang because of the fraud and so on with the P2P initiatives and all that. The other fact was that initially when Li became the premier, his first initiative, in fact, if some of you may remember, was on urbanization. That was immediately created a phenomenon of many villages pushing their residents into high-rises and a lot of land confiscation. And she essentially put that to a stop. So as a result, I think actually this is an evolutionary relationship in a way. And of course, as she has taken on the leadership group positions, whether it's finance and economics and others, so he simply he has dominated. So there are other possibilities to think about it. But overall, though, I do think actually when he's playing so many games simultaneously, you have to drop the ball from time to time. It's just impossible to keep everything in the air as a result. But at the same time, some of the issues of reform are simply so difficult to tackle, including the issue of debt. Right? But let's also keep in mind that the debt level in China has reached the U.S. level. So in other words, it depends on how you pose the issue. It's high, but it's also every other major developed country has debt levels that are just as high as China's. The Chinese economy has to slow down, but at the same time, there is significant efforts to reform as well, or certainly in terms of dynamic changes with Chinese economy shifting to more economic and service sectors and so on. So all of those actually are issues that are on the docket. But my sense is actually when it comes, in the end, I think a lot of the issues would be what would be the role of Li Keqiang going forward. Would he continue to be the prime minister, or is he going to be shifted to another position? By previous rules, the only two people who actually are at the age to retain their seats on the Politburo Standing Committee. And that raises very interesting issues, definitely, in there. The other issue is also a lot of the ministerial changes will be very interesting, I think, actually, so sort of, including also at the provincial level. And again, typically, it's the party secretary who dominates the scene compared to the premier. But Li is not, certainly, I mean, he has certain influence in there. So sort of, so I think this game will continue. But I do want to mention one final point. Li actually is very interesting in the sense that he has not been seen, number one, he's not being considered to be corrupt. Number two, he's also being seen as not being really pushing his own faction or something like that. So he's played a very interesting political game. So it's very hard for Xi to, except for policy errors, it's very hard for Xi to say, you're my enemy or something like that. In fact, Li gains a lot of sympathy by not being seen as very aggressive, which is a very interesting kind of situation in the Chinese context at this moment.
Sort of the anti-Bo Xilai. Chris? No? Okay, all right. Yes, Harry.
Thank you. I'm Harry Harding of the University of Virginia and Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. My question is for Professor Xu, and I would invite him to say a little bit more about what he sees as the evolving relationship between the, call it the party state, and the Chinese middle class. If I understood you correctly, you argued that protest, discontent is beginning to spread upward, if you will, in the structure. From the lower classes, farmers, working classes, up to the middle class. But that at the same time, the party state's response to that, and those are largely material concerns, the party state's response is not to negotiate material or policy solutions, but rather to crack down. And if I understood that correctly, then I'm curious as to what you see are the costs and benefits, or benefits and risks of that shift in approach. Because I would think that, first of all, material concerns are far easier to deal with through negotiation than concerns that involve more fundamental structural issues, and especially if they begin to morph into concerns about values, freedom of speech, press, democracy, and so forth, freedom of assembly and organization. And doesn't a crackdown response increase the possibility that the concerns will begin to morph away from purely the material and over to the more basically political? So I don't understand the logic of that trend if indeed, and I have no doubt that your analysis is correct. I may have misunderstood it, however. If indeed that's occurring, I would see this as a rather risky strategy over the longer term.
Go ahead. Oh, yeah. Professor Zhou.
Okay, I think my point is that according to my own observation, some of the middle class group, they do show their willingness to participate in, to some degree, the policy making, or at least they can express their interest. And to some degree, they also through the kind of the protest. But as you just mentioned, and also as well as in my presentation, the most of their interest is focused on the material needs. So it's easier for the government to persuade or try to control this kind of unrest from the middle class through the kind of economic profit to them. But to some degree, those so-called middle class, for example, the business person or even the teachers, they will cooperate to some human rights lawyer and try to protect their own interests through the expanding the channel for them to express their own opinion. But there's a bottom line. They can aware this kind of a bottom line. So for them, there are kind of a red line or the bottom line for those middle class. They will not cross that. But to some degree, because sometimes they will use they will utilize their the social status or their resources through a kind of an indirect way to cooperate with some, as I said, the human rights lawyer or other group. They feel unsatisfied to the social situation. But it's also easy for the government to provide some the material profit for them. So, and rather than to pursue some the hawkish or very hard way to crack down those the middle class levels or middle class persons, they are Protestants.
Yeah, I agree with Professor Harding's observation that this is a strategy that does not serve its own purpose. But I think the root of the problem comes from what I mentioned in my presentation, that the Xi Jinping's regime harbors this, I think, a false perception that there is some kind of a clandestine coalition between external opponent forces and the internal elements, rebellion elements. And some of the NGOs or civil society forces are identified by Xi Jinping regime as the instigating elements. For example, this lawyers group has been, I think, intentionally rounded up, and as a showcase, because it has very clear overseas connection. It's a showcase that there's such a conspiracy, enemy exists. I think he has a deep sense of insecurity. So this is why, in the later stage of Hu Jintao's regime, a lot of scholars studying Chinese politics has identified the phenomena that the authoritarian regime can coexist with a burgeoning civil society. And they say it's a sign of authoritarian resilience, but that resilience is gone because of this kind of false perception. Thank you.
Another question? You're asked out, I guess. I guess your stomachs are speaking to you, if that could be. We've had a full discussion, a good 360 on domestic politics and economics and social change. I was just trying to recall my Samuel Huntington reading, and as you all were going back and forth on that last question, which I'll think about during lunch, which reminds me to explain. For lunch this afternoon, you're going to go back through the doors in the back of the room, across the hallway to the Summers room, which is where we've laid out the buffet for everybody, and you're welcome to eat there or in here or outside in front, depending on what you feel about the temperature. There's another conference going on to our side, so you don't want to go out this door and take their food, because that won't leave enough for them. But of course, that's where the bathroom facilities are. So we're going to adjourn right now, and then I think we're going to come back at just before 1 o'clock. And then we'll have a luncheon presentation. I know this one you won't want to miss. It's going to be fantastic. Enjoy your lunch and see you all in just a few minutes. Please join me in thanking the panelists.